You're not alone. You don't have to do it alone. And you really can't do it alone. You have a right to feel how you feel. You have the right to make steps that make you safe, both for the addicts and the partners. So you're not alone.
Welcome to Beyond Theory, a podcast powered by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare that brings you in-depth conversations from the front lines of mental health and addiction recovery. I'm David Condos. For someone with an alcohol addiction, recovery usually means never drinking again. But for those with a sex addiction, life in recovery isn't that simple. So how does Dr. Erica Sarr help men dealing with compulsive, disruptive sexual behavior learn what long-term healthy sexuality looks like? Let's get out of the abstract and see how this applies in the real world. It's time to go beyond theory.
Hello, I'm Dr. Erica Sarr, and I'm the clinical director at General Path at the Meadows.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Sarr. How are
Glad
you?
to be here.
Good. We'll start with kind of launching into your story, kind of who you are as a person, the journey you took to getting into this world of recovery.
Sure. So I guess the best way to describe it is I've always been interested in why people do what they do. And so I briefly toyed with the idea of joining the FBI or the CIA because that seemed like ways that you could use your talents and your interest in understanding why people do what they do.
Profiling.
Yeah. But that really wasn't my path. So ultimately, I did a few things. I moved around. Ultimately, I landed on deciding to go into psychology. So I went into a master's program in Maryland and met a mentor there who said, I know this guy who works with sex offenders. How do you feel about that work? And I said, well, I want to work with sexuality. Like that's a really important part of this process for me. Because I'd always found that a really fascinating part of the human experience that people commercialize and discuss in lurid ways, but they don't really talk about it substantively.
Not really the truth of it, the meat of it.
Yeah. And so I'm open to working with sex offenders. So I went, and that was my placement in my master's program. That was my clinical placement. And I remember putting my hand on the doorknob at this place and being like, what if I can't do this? And that was my last hesitation because the therapists I worked with were wonderful. The clients were wonderful. They really wanted to be understood. For the most part, there are a few people who were struggling more, but mainly they were grateful that somebody cared about their experience and wanted to help them get well.
And was actually treating them like a person?
Like a person, yeah. The program I went to has a specialty program where I could get a dual degree in human sexuality. And so I really am highly specialized in that area. And so I worked largely with offenders again. I worked in forensic foster care with juvenile offenders and adult offenders. And ultimately, actually, in my final placement, ended up working in a sex addiction clinic. And my first thought about the sex addiction clinic was, what if these are just sex offenders with money?
Because they can get away with things.
Right. Yeah. Because I really didn't have a framework to understand sex addiction. That wasn't the model that I'd really worked under. And I was really worried about that because a lot of folks in the sex offender world, their outcomes really were affected by their socioeconomic status. But when I got into that work, I was like, oh no, this is a thing. Like people are worried that it's just an excuse. But when you talk to someone who's like, I've spent $300,000 in the last 2 years on sex workers, and I don't have $300,000. There's a compulsive aspect to that that's hard to deny, right? It's one thing to cheat. Not every cheater is an addict, but to cheat at that level, that literally in the face of life-altering circumstances, you can't stop. So I was really intrigued. So I enjoyed the work there. I stayed on after my internship. And, ultimately met some people from the Meadows at a conference. They really liked the work I was doing around healthy sexuality and sobriety and kind of invited me to join their team. And slightly over a year ago, I took over as clinical director here at the General Path program, which is the men's sex addiction unit.
Yeah. And so looking at General Path now.
Yeah.
I know that's based on a lot of the teachings of Patrick Carnes,
Mm-hmm.
who's a Meadows Senior Fellow as well. And so talk about kind of how you integrate his teachings into the program, like on a day-to-day kind of
Yeah.
kind of way, working with the
Yeah.
patients. Yeah.
So, like, task number one is breakthrough denial. So that's what we spend a lot of time doing. Hopefully, we don't spend somebody's entire stay on task one. But that's a big part of the work. Some other tasks that are integrated on a day-to-day basis have to do with like restoring bodily integrity and accountability and building a culture of support. And so the guys go to daily 12-step meetings to build that culture of support. Most of the therapy takes place in group therapy, not because I don't have the resources to do individual. I mean, I could, if it was the right thing to do, put everybody through 8 hours of individual therapy a day. And some people are happily like, how much does that cost? I got to check. And I just tell them, I'm like, it's not the way to treat your issue. You can't treat intimacy in isolation. So you have to get used to telling people your story, your shame, telling your truth, having your accountability, and have somebody look you in the eye and say, that behavior is not okay. I'll still show up for you. I'll still help you. I'll still eat lunch with you. But you need to know that wasn't all right what you did, because those are the earmarks of a healthy relationship. Everybody lets somebody down. Everybody makes a mistake. Everybody's occasionally not their best selves. But if we try to hide that from people, it just exacerbates on a day-to-day basis. And so feelings like sadness, pain, guilt are useful, but most people come in saying, how do I live a life where I only feel peace and joy for the rest of my life? And that's where we integrate Pia Melody's work, one of our other senior fellows, and we look at her trauma model and we're like, well, all these emotions, including sadness and anger and fear, are natural parts of the human experience.
It can be useful.
Yeah. And you want to have those. If you try to remove those, you're actually trying to live a crippled life, a stunted life. And that's not really going to serve you well.
Yeah. And that's kind of missing the point.
Yeah.
All right. So with Gentle Path, it's focused on men with sex addiction and things kind of related to that. Tell us about kind of the spectrum that you're seeing. What does the population look like for the men that you're working with?
Yeah, I think that's changed over the years, and it's still changing because technology is getting out in front of us in leaps and bounds. Every industry knows that technology is changing faster than regulation and law and all that. And so we're just discovering and just being able to do some of the research now around the effects of pornography, things like that, because the traditional model that Dr. Carnes studied and researched was about people who came from rigid and disengaged family systems where they didn't learn about healthy intimacy, they didn't learn about connection in a healthy way. And so sex was kind of the medicine that filled in as an illusion for real, authentic attachment and intimacy. What we're finding now is some of our younger sex addicts have perfectly healthy attachment and healthy families, but they've been watching hardcore pornography since they were like 10 because they did a web search. And whereas back in the day, a 10-year-old boy might have been interested in what the girls in his class looked like, but nowadays they'll get 10 million pages of explicit sex scenes, which is actually traumatic for children because they don't really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And so that changes the whole course of their sexuality. So you start to get things like porn-induced erectile dysfunction, which is erectile problems in young men who don't have any medical reason for that to be happening, other than they're just conditioning their bodies to pornography versus face-to-face, human interaction. Yeah. But the current state of how people interact with pornography, how they interact with the sex work industry, how they interact with, all those bits of technology is currently problematic for how our brain is structured.
So technology is really changing how you do your job.
Yes. So on top of that, that adds a new kind of cadre of a different kind of sex addict compared to we still have our folks who have childhood traumas, childhood sexual abuse, family of origin issues, those kinds of things. So we still have folks who follow the classic model. But we also have other folks, because I'm so interested in human sexuality in all its forms, we get folks who have problems that they need to address in a residential setting, but maybe aren't sex addicts. And we kind of try to help them sort that out. And they come and they abstain from sexuality for 90 days while they're, in our program, and for 45 days after, not because they're an addict, but because they're like, I want to get a little bit of breathing space to sort out what's going on for me sexually.
Yeah, so kind of just taking a pause to reassess what's going on.
So we don't do conversion therapy. That's not legal or ethical or doesn't work. So we don't do any of that, but we do sit with people in the struggle. We say, okay, you have this behavior you want to stop, but you have this fear about who you are. Let's just look at all parts of that. And you're the only person who can make a decision about that.
Yeah. And so kind of within that broad spectrum, how do you define sex addiction?
So it kind of goes off of how I define addiction in general, which is taking any behavior or substance and using it to manage an emotion, and usually maladaptively manage an emotion, right? So sex is not bad in and of itself. Food is not bad in and of itself, but when we start using sex or food or money or work or shopping or substances kind of come immediately with their own problems, because they're foreign agents into the body. So they're not supposed to be there, right? The brain, treats them in a different way. Behavioral addictions are even more challenging because you're taking a natural process. Your body wants to have sexual relations with other creatures. It wants to eat. Gambling is kind of based in that survival instinct of pattern recognition and things like that. And it wants to do those things, but it started to use them in a problematic way. And so that's kind of how I define it for folks, because we get a lot of addiction interaction where people have been sober from alcohol for 25 years, never dealt with the underlying pain that was causing them to drink, and upon reflection realized they've been acting out sexually that whole time. And they're like, oh, I was dry but not sober. And that doesn't mean it wasn't an amazing accomplishment to not drink for 25 years. It absolutely was. But they never dealt with the underlying stuff. And so what I tell them is it's like, it's the same cake, you just put different frosting on it. And the cake is still there. And that's what has to be dealt with if you want real change.
Yeah. And so you mentioned earlier about like boundary violation.
Yeah.
So what role do boundaries play, and kind of how do you help these men understand how to set and maintain healthy boundaries if they're not used to that?
It depends on where they come in with an understanding. Some guys are like, what is a boundary? Like they couldn't even define that concept. And we're back to basic concepts like, if you had a dog and you didn't want it to run out of your yard, you'd have to have a fence or a chain. Those are boundaries, right? So let's assume that your childish impulses to say, ooh, I want candy. Ooh, I want to touch that lady. Ooh, I want to drink, whatever it is a really enthusiastic dog. And until you get time to train that dog, it has to be behind a fence, right? So we start with having you go to rehab. It's basically a fence. What I want to do is train you to train your dog, right? And I'm not calling men dogs. I worry about that metaphor, but
like the behavior, like the childish impulses, like you said. Yeah.
It's a very enthusiastic part of ourselves. If we get Freudian, that's the id, right? But so we might start with that, but then we talk about not just boundaries, but boundaries that they've set but that they're resentful about, or boundaries that are invisible. So like maybe they never realized that when they got married, they had an invisible belief that their wife would be sexually available to them every day. And then they got married and they had kids, and their wife is working and they're working, and they realize like sometimes weeks or months go by and maybe their partner doesn't have as high a sex drive as them or isn't into what they're into or whatever, but they never talk about it because they never learned how to talk about things. And so they gradually build resentments. And so part of the boundaries work is you have to tell people what you want, right? They're not obligated to give it to you, but you're more likely to get what you want if you ask.
Setting up communication as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Another part is the idea that no is a complete sentence, right? These are guys who are really good at finding the reasons why boundaries don't matter or boundaries don't apply to them, or just in this one instance, couldn't you? And they're able for a long time in their lives to get across boundaries because of charm, force, money, power, whatever. And they're really not used to finding any stops. And that's often an echo of having no boundaries in childhood, where they had someone who sexually violated them or a parent who was never there for them or never told them no. And so it wasn't modeled for them that no is an okay answer. That's part of being a functional adult, is sometimes things don't go our way and I don't get to act out because I didn't get my way. Like that's not how an adult world works. But it makes perfect sense to them when they're in their trauma. Well, you didn't give me a cookie, so I'll steal my cookie, right? You won't show up for me emotionally the way I want, so I'll go get a girlfriend who will. It's their way of saying, I wish you would show up for me the way I want,
Right. Yeah.
but and feeling like it's an imperative. And that's what's so difficult, is that sometimes these drives, that's the compulsive part, is that they feel imperative to follow through on, which makes it different than kind of a classic just having an affair because it's easy and it's there, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And so shifting gears a little bit, I know you've mentioned that you have a special passion for tech addiction, video game addiction. I guess give us an overview of that. How does that show up, and how is it similar or different to some of these other compulsions we're talking about?
It shows up a little less probably because we're spending so much time working with sex that we often don't have time to get to it. The tech addiction, I would love to spend all the time in video games because I'm a video gamer myself. And I think sex is a really beautiful, amazing, creative part of the human experience that gets hijacked to manage our emotions in a way that wasn't intended. I love video games. There's tons of research about how they're awesome and they can do lots of good things for us. And people can also completely vanish into them if their real world isn't what they want it to be. Any kind of technology has the potential to be used the way you want it to be used, because the sex industry is often on the forefront of any technological innovation because they know they have an end product that sells.
Right. The demand is there, the money is
so
there. Yeah.
even their early beta versions that aren't so great, somebody wants it because it's the neat and new thing that's sexual.
And so looking at kind of your end goal in the work that you do, what does like long-term healthy sexuality and recovery look like?
Ideally, it's going to look like more connected sexuality. And that may be with a partner. It may be just connected with yourself, right? The idea is that healthy sexuality is that which doesn't coerce anyone, is consensual with everybody involved, brings you closer to joy and pleasure and connection rather than shame and fear and pain and degradation, right? And so if solo sexuality is kind of your choice or your path, and you can figure out a way that makes you feel connected to, a higher power or your value system, great. If that's monogamy, great. If it's consensual non-monogamy, great. It's going to be more challenging for you as an addict, but it's possible, but it requires a lot of communication and a lot of work. And the biggest pitfall I've seen people make is that they want to make those decisions too soon, They haven't gotten far enough away from the betrayals that they've done to others to say, okay, now's the time to really kind of start weighing these things. We ask our folks to be sexually celibate for 90 days. Not, again, not because I think sex is bad, but because I want to give you a little bit of breathing room to really think about it. Like from a sort of like observing ego, kind of one level up. Like, okay, what am I really deciding here rather than being impulsive? I want it now. What's good for me? What's congruent with my values? What's congruent with what feels right with my identity? And I also tell people, don't draw party hats on the calendar at day 90, like, because you might be there. Because I've had people who called me frantically on day 70 and be like, me and my wife had this amazing connected sex. Did I relapse? And I'm like, no, you're good. Like it was a consensual process. It was connected. It was beautiful. Good. Talk about it with your therapist, but you're good. And I've had people who got to day 89 and called me frantically and said, I can't have sex with my partner. I'm not there in my own system. I'm too traumatized, but I feel like if I push it out, they're going to feel rejected. And so it is a process, and it's a unique process, and you have to be in consultation. So that's a big part of it.
Yeah, yeah. And so back to kind of when you were talking about what interested you about working in this field, you're saying that kind of partially what drew you to it was how you saw like our culture kind of distorting it and kind of hijacking it. I think like you said. So with anything that's sexual, there's going to be a lot of misconceptions out there. What would be one thing that you wish the general public understood better about sex and sex addiction and healthy sexuality?
Oh, I have so many things I wish people knew. The biggest thing that I wish that people knew about sex addiction is that it's not an excuse for bad behavior. I think with things that happen in the media, sometimes people are afraid, well, anytime somebody cheats or anytime somebody violates somebody, they're going to say they're a sex addict and they're going to go away to some resort and they're going to get better. And then they are not to be held to account for their behavior. And, I lectured to the military and I've lectured to police, and they have that same fear. And I said, it is a misconception. If you have an illness, you have a responsibility to manage it. If your illness would cause you to black out behind the wheel of a car and you know that, but you knowingly drive and don't do anything to manage that illness, and you crash your car and you hurt people, you made a choice that hurt people and you're responsible for the consequences of that choice. And so for me, it's more about understanding, going back to the very root of what you asked me, why did I get into this? Helping people understand why they do what they do. Some people do it because they're reenacting their trauma. Some people do it because they don't have basic sex education. Some people do it because they have frontal lobe injuries. Some people do it because they have a compulsion. Some people like to see people hurt. Some people have, embedded misogyny. The treatment programs for each of those people is radically different. I can do some of that work. I can't do some of that work. So it's important for me to figure out who I can help the ones I can, and send the ones I can't to the places that they can be treated.
Yeah. And so just to wrap up, two quick questions. First is, for someone who wants to dive a little bit deeper into this, what would be a favorite book or resource that you would recommend on this topic?
I really like Alex Katahakis's Mirror of Intimacy. It's like daily reflections on sexuality and intimacy, and it gives you not only like quotes and things like that, but something to really reflect on every day related to your own intimacy with others. The other book that's maybe less kind of recovery related, but I think is so profound for so many people that I've worked with, is called Reinventing Your Life by Jeffrey Young. And it's about schema therapy, which is about the concept of that our past life experiences kind of put a lens over our eyes by which we filter all future information. And we need to be cognizant of those lenses because it really does distort the choices we make. And so when you apply that to addiction, if somebody believes that everyone in the world is going to be an abuser and there are only wolves or sheep in the world, why wouldn't you be a wolf? you know? So you really help people look at that lens. If they can peel that lens back, they can have a different relationship with the world that profoundly affects their ability to be in recovery.
Yeah. Right. Finally, what would be a piece of advice that you'd like to leave listeners with? Something that's meant a lot to you or that you find yourself passing on?
You're not alone. You don't have to do it alone, and you really can't do it alone. If the guys I worked with could have thought their way out of this problem, I never would have met any of them. They're smart, they're resourceful. Most of them are highly, highly motivated for change, and all of them are highly motivated to not be in pain. And they're terrified of intimacy. And I also say that to their partners and their families. You are not alone. You are not crazy for still loving a person who's betrayed you. You are not crazy for wanting to leave them. None of those choices are bad. And you have a right to feel how you feel, and you have the right to make steps that make you safe, both for the addicts and the partners. So you're not alone.
Dr. Erica Sarr is a licensed clinical psychologist and the clinical director for Gentle Path at the Meadows in Wickenburg, Arizona. You can find out more about that specialized program for sex addiction treatment at gentlepathmeadows.com. Beyond Theory is produced and hosted by me, David Condos. You can discover more from this podcast, including videos of each conversation, at beyondtheorypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of Beyond Theory.